When the girl died, her life from that day on was a foregone conclusion. She had no other option left. Everything was written ahead. But that's not where the story begins. It started back at the ball the girl attended for the first time, and it was incredibly dazzling. This girl was feeding Armin. She was the daughter of Duke Armin and was incredibly scared that day. There were too many people at this event, and it even made her breathless. At one moment she felt her head start to spin, and she couldn't even stand in one place straight. But at the moment when she should have fallen to the floor because she couldn't keep her balance, she was suddenly picked up from behind by someone. As soon as the Fed looked at him, she was very surprised, for this man was Bernard Demeter. He was the heir to the title of Marquis and the bodyguard of the Crown Prince. He looked the girl straight in the eyes and said caringly that she almost fell over and her cheeks even turned red, and it was indeed true. It was that night that she met him, the man she now can't even imagine her life without. The Fed bowed and thanked him for catching it. The man looked at her for a while, then said it was no big deal. And the moment he saved her from universal shame, the girl fell in love with him at first sight. After this event, the feeder immediately came to her father's office the next day. She was incredibly serious. The girl came closer to her father's table, and then said in a raised tone that she had a man she wanted to marry and tie her fate for the rest of her days with him. Her father was Fel Armin, and he was also a duke. The man looked at his daughter in surprise, trying to figure out if she was serious. Nurse was actually very worried at this point. She didn't know how her father would react to such words, so she was even afraid of his reaction. For a while the files were just silent. After that he said he agreed, would do anything he could for it. The girl, when she heard this, was very much surprised, but immediately thanked her father for this consent. At the time, the only thing on her mind was that she would be able to marry the man she had fallen in love with at first sight, and her thoughts were capable of nothing else. But in fact, she could not even think that it would lead her to her own grave. Soon after that, her father organized for the girl to meet her lover. And so, when Bernard came to the nursemaid's house for afternoon tea, he said sternly that he didn't want to marry her, and he certainly had no intention of falling in love with her. When the girl heard this, she was incredibly surprised. She actually didn't even expect that he could refuse her like this. And now that she was nursing, knew the consequences after what had happened. She wasn't sure if she should have given up on him even then and not insisted so much. But the girl at that moment was half in love with him. So she began to insist, saying that she had heard that he had a lover who was not up to status. Then she looked at him and said that it was probably just a passing fancy and nothing serious. And then she asked him if it was true. At that moment she was young, and for the first time she was able to know what love was, even if it was not mutual. This feeling swept over her head, and she did not even realize that it was possible to retreat. Now, if you look at the situation as an adult, you can realize that it was just youthful maximalism. The girl was incredibly upset at the time, and without even looking at him said she loved him incredibly much. Eventually, the nurse herself was able to believe in this foolishness. Bernard did not have to be persuaded for long, and soon they had a great wedding. And when the girl was already standing near the altar next to her favorite man, she calmed herself, telling herself that everything would be all right, and it was just nerves because she was marrying someone for the first time. Of course, like any girl, it seemed to Cormila at that moment that she was the protagonist of the whole world, and no one else existed, only she and her beloved. The girl realized that all she had to do at the moment was to overcome this incomprehensible anxiety, which had arisen from nowhere. Nurse knew that now came just that very happy moment in her life, from which her beautiful life would begin next to the man she loved. But then she suddenly realized that she was just a third-rate villain and a romance novelist, who was just an obstacle in the way of the true love that occupied a major role in the story. One day of her happy but soon-to-be unhappy marriage, when Bernard came home from his work, the nurse immediately approached him. The girl was no longer as happy as she used to be. Her eyes no longer had the spark they had at the beginning. Love was slowly evaporating in her heart. Then she turned to Bernard in a serious voice and said that they needed to have a serious talk. The man immediately turned around and looked at his wife in surprise. She didn't say anything for a while. After that, she said in a cold voice that they were going to have a child. She came close to him as she climbed the stairs and told him that she knew perfectly well that he didn't love her. But with tears in her eyes, the girl also added that if he can't be a good husband, at least she wants him to be a good father to his own child. Her hands were shaking because of all these emotions, and the nurse said that in that case, she would continue to endure all this, because he could do at least this small action of bringing up his child normally. She's not asking for some good treatment for herself, only for her child. In any case, there was still a small hope in the girl's mind that with a child, they could be a good and loving couple. It would bring them together. She looked at her husband with an encouraging gaze. Bernard, however, looked at her silently for some time, and afterward, without a word of reply to her speech, he turned around and began to climb back up to his bedroom. And in the end, Cormilla's courage of character and fortitude never made an impact, never even managed to touch his calloused soul. What she wanted most of all at that moment was for him not to go away, not to leave her alone with all these problems, but to support her and love her at last. When she was alone, standing on the stairs, she was ready to cry on the spot. She didn't understand why he was doing this to her. But soon after that, she unfortunately lost her baby, as the doctor explained to her. Soon her body was initially so weak that she needed to rest properly all the time. But her psychological state consumed the girl's health, so that the baby could not cope with it. Despite the fact that this baby was only in her belly, nursing, she loved him with all her heart, and this loss was a terrifying event for her. And until the end, the girl did not want to see anyone. If she needed anything, she asked to do it with Luca or the butler. The girl did not leave her room for days and did not let anyone near her. But now the girl has another problem to solve, and if she has to fight with some commoner, and even if it makes her fall to her level, she, deprived of her husband, child, and pride, is ready to go for it without any hesitation. One day when she finally came to her senses, and the maid was helping her get ready, she told the maid that she had some business to attend to. When she inquired where she was going, soon afterward the girl arrived in town. She was dressed very simply, and knocked on the door of one of the houses. Then a girl named Raina immediately opened the door for her. She was the daughter of the Demeter family's nanny. When Raina saw a stranger on her doorstep, she wondered who she was, but the nurse decided not to beat around the bush, and said in a stern voice that she was the reason her baby died. She continued stretching out the slow word and also said that she was the reason her marriage failed. Then the girl could no longer contain her emotions and hit the commoner right in the face, saying that all the troubles were only because of her. Raina looked at the girl in surprise. In fact, she was used to being beaten, so she didn't take it personally. She was more surprised that the child had actually died. Nurse gently touched her hand to her belly, where her dearest person in the world used to be, and screaming to the whole street, said that this was how her baby died. She kept screaming, repeating time after time that her child was dead. But the girl didn't understand why Raina was still alive, and her precious child was dead. She swung for another blow, but then a man suddenly appeared behind her and stopped her by grabbing her arm. That man turned out to be Bernard, and he quickly brought the girl's hand down, hitting her cheek himself with all his might. Because of this blow, the nurse couldn't even stand on her feet. She fell to the ground, but she still glared angrily at the commoner who didn't understand what was even happening. Raina, with tears in her eyes, watched the girl for a while. Then she looked at Bernard and began to shout at him, asking how he could do that, because he had hit her so hard that she had fallen to the ground. She moved closer to the man, asking if he could really let himself do this to his wife. She watched this action in surprise, but then suddenly her assistant came up to her and helped her stand up. Rising to her feet, the girl thought that it was more like some kind of crocodile tears, not realizing how this girl in front of her could be so brazenly deceitful. And when the girl got to her feet, she went over to the commoner, and continuing to shout, told her not to make her slimy appearance as if she were worried about it. Feed said, and she was the one who had messed up her life the most, the one who had broken her into small pieces and burned her. Then she reached a little farther and inquired if the girl liked being the mistress of another man's husband. She continued to yell at the commoner, saying that he was the father of her child, and asked if the girl was happy now that he was only with her, and never chose his own wife. The nurse was silent for a while, but after looking at Raina's pitiful face, she said that the girl was just awful with her angelic expression. She acted as if she didn't know what she was doing. In fact, the girl was well aware of her actions and was nothing but evil incarnate. After saying these words, she went back to her carriage and ordered the coachman to take her quickly away from this horrible place where only hypocrites lived. As she drove down the steep road, she thought about how the marriage she had dreamed of so much from the beginning had ended up being unrealistic already. And she is not the protagonist at all. The girl was just a determined, greedy villain who thwarted these holy men in their beautiful and unrivaled story. And so, while she was riding in the wagon, something went wrong, and the wagon overturned, even caught fire. She fell to the ground, and it became very difficult for her to breathe. The girl lay looking up at the sky, thinking, "Is this really the kind of ending a villain should have?" But it was only afterward that she was able to realize that she herself had been to blame. Soon her eyes began to close and she fell into a dead sleep. But then suddenly she came back to life and began to even feel a surge of strength and energy. When the nurse opened her eyes, to her surprise, she was back to a time when she had not even married yet. She had been given a second chance at a good and decent life. She realized that she absolutely had to take advantage of this incredible opportunity. And the first thing she had to do was to prevent that horrible marriage. After the nurse had paid too high a price for all this, she came to her father and said she wanted to dissolve her marriage to her husband. She wasn't going to live such a worthless life anymore. When she saw her father's frightened face, she said that, to be more precise, she didn't even want to marry him. No more feeder is going to stand still. She's going to move in the direction that she wants to be happy. But at that moment, memories from her past life suddenly started coming to her. That moment when she blamed everything on Raina for her miscarriage. But Raina was really excited and said she couldn't even think about the fact that there could have been a miscarriage. The girl said that she loved Bern very much and just wanted to be together with him just for a little while. She didn't think anything could happen if she saw him for a little while. The girl hugged Bernard and said that she didn't want something like this to ever happen. She apologized to Caroline and Bernard, saying that she really didn't want to hurt them. She kept blaming herself and saying it was only because of her greed. She didn't want it to be like this, but it was her fault and no one else's. Then Raina suddenly pulled away from his embrace and said that she wanted to leave him and asked that he should hate her with all his soul, for she did not deserve his beautiful and wonderful love. However, Bernard immediately grabbed her arm, asking her what she was even saying. What could she possibly be guilty of, since he was the only one who could be bad in this situation? He hugged his beloved and told her not to blame herself in any way and not to say such terrible things. At this time, Bernard was drilling his wife with his horribly evil gaze, and Fee didn't understand how he could even look at her that way when their own child was dead. Their common child was dead. She watched Bernard try to comfort Raina and thought about how he had never even hugged her like that, much less comforted and supported his own wife. Raina calmed down a bit and turned to the woman and apologized, saying that she loved this man very much and couldn't leave and live without him. She wouldn't live even a minute without his gaze and voice. In that moment, Feed realized that all of this wasn't just another horrible dream. This was her nightmarish life that was actually happening to her. Her father, when he heard that she wanted to give up the marriage, was surprised and asked what her fickleness was, for she had said so much that she wanted to marry him. The girl replied that she knew that perfectly well, but said she didn't want to do it anyway. Nurse thought about the fact that he had married her not because he loved her to pieces, but because he wanted to protect his love for Raina. Up to this point, the girl had only denied everything, but she knew it perfectly well. But she thought that if Raina disappeared, everything would go back to normal, and he would even love her. And that's not how it happened at all. So now, she doesn't want to make the same mistake. Raina was not a secret lover, but a real lover, the one you can't imagine your life without. So she turned to her father and said emphatically that she didn't think they should have this marriage. Fell was silent for a while, and after that, he said that if this was all just because her fiancé did something immature, then she might know that this happens to men before they get married. She is an adult after all, so he should just let her forget about it and move on. The girl realized that it would not be easy to cancel this marriage. She had been the first to speak of it, and had shown such great initiative in persuading her father to agree. In fact, she was sick to death of hearing such phrases ever since she was a child. She'd always been told to mind her own business and not be a nuisance to others. Always her parents had told her that Nurse should be mindful of her position, and these phrases prevented her from doing anything sincere or thoughtless. She couldn't make any decisions on her own, but now she no longer wanted to follow those stupid words and requests. So the girl turned to her father again, saying that the man was not at all going to break up with the woman named Raina, with whom he had been with before. Then Carmilla realized that her methods were not working, so she decided to even kneel down. The girl asked her father very strongly, saying that she didn't want to live in this hell, so she begged him to allow her not to do this marriage and get her out of this horror that she was going to go through. The girl put her head down and didn't even look him in the eyes. She said in a sad voice that she would do anything he just asked in return. All she wants is for him to let her not do it. Then suddenly the man couldn't stand it. He stood up from the table and slapped his hand on the wood, angrily addressing her. Fell came closer to her and crouched down, asking her what she was doing. Then he asked her to get up from her knees. But Feed continued to sit on the floor and said she was dead serious and wasn't going to get up until he let her. She said in a very serious voice that there was no way to change her fiancé's mind, so she really wanted her father to break off this horrible engagement. But when Feed looked at her father, she was very surprised, for it was the first time she had seen the shock on his face. But it was not at all surprising to her. In fact, he almost never made that facial expression, for the girl was not exactly a troubled daughter and always solved her problems on her own, as she had been taught to do. They were silent for a while. Then the father sighed heavily and, closing his eyes, said that he needed to think about this request for a while before making a final decision. He turned around and started to walk back to his desk, saying that this matter concerned the whole family, so the decision would not be as easy as she thought. He also asked the girl to go back to her room, because he needed to make a decision in private. In fact, Nurse was even happy with this result, because it was already enough. She actually didn't even think that he would even consider the matter. The most important thing she was able to say was that she didn't want to enter into this marriage. After this conversation, the girl went to her room and, to distract herself and keep her hands busy, sat back down to her embroidery. And so, when her painting was already finished, a woman suddenly came into her room and turned to Carmilla. The girl turned around and gave her a surprised look. In fact, the woman was her mom. Her mother looked very stern and said that there was no such thing as a happy marriage in the world, and besides, she herself wished so much for this marriage. And now she wanted to break off the engagement because of some mistress of the groom. It was utterly stupid of a woman to do such a thing. The woman, who was far from young, looked sternly at her daughter and said that this was absolutely no reason at all for breaking off such a lucrative engagement and wedding. Carmilla was surprised at this reaction from her mother. However, she started to get up from the table, saying that not all marriages are hell, and it is completely wrong to judge everything by one single case. She stepped closer to her, and with her head held proudly high said that if she would rather have a perfectly arranged marriage. Nurse also said that she doesn't want to be unhappy for love. She just can't take it. So her mom and the rest of her family may call her stupid, but she really wants them to be on her side for once. And her mother said nothing. The girl stood there for a while, not knowing what she should do, or whether she should kneel down to make her mom believe her at least a little. She also suggested that you could start crying like a madwoman, or go into a frenzy, or grab her sleeve and just beg for a very long time until she said yes. After a long silence, Caroline took her mother's hand to say a few more words, but she immediately pulled it away. The woman examined her daughter with a cold gaze for some time and did not utter a single word. But after that, she turned around and started walking away. She was shocked that she just walked away without saying a word. Once again, she feels the loss of her child, and life is like hell. This beautiful house, which is fundamentally different from her worthless state, makes her feel worse. Nurse fell to the ground and folded her hands in supplication, thinking that she didn't want to go through all this pain anymore. But then suddenly she was interrupted by someone entering the room. It was a maid. Her name was Reese. She went to her mistress and knelt down to apologize, saying it was all her tongue and no bones, and it was all her fault. She said she was so engrossed in the various rumors and gossip that she didn't even bother to notice that her body was suddenly weak. The maid cried and said that she had never even imagined that things could lead to this very thing. In fact, in the past, it was Reese who had been the one to tell her about Rain. But before that, she didn't care what people thought, and she had even kicked that poor kid out the door in a past life for acting like that. When the girl felt bad, she had finally realized that other people's pain was very much like her own. And now Feed was thinking about how the maid must have been in incredible pain at that moment, losing her job because of the concerns of her landlady, who had even written her a letter of recommendation. And now the girl was thinking about how Reese probably didn't even have anywhere to go after that. In fact, at that moment, the maid told the truth, and she just kicked her out because she was uncomfortable hearing those words. So now Feeder came close to her and hugged the maid tightly. When Reese saw this, she asked Mistress in surprise, "What happened?" The girl replied that it was actually fine, and she had been cruel to her all this time, and it was totally unfair. Feed also said that she was well aware that she broke the news because she was worried about her mistress, and was acting too immature and petty. The maid couldn't stand it then, and even began to cry even more. But the girl asked, smiling, that she shouldn't cry because people would think that she was the one who made her suffer like that. Reese immediately apologized to her and, covering her face with her hands, said she thought she had committed a mortal sin because she had ruined her marriage. She wanted to say something else, but Feed came closer to her and started wiping her tears with the back of her hands, telling her that it wasn't her fault. She had only told the truth. The girl smiled, and also said that it would have been worse if she hadn't known about it and lived in ignorance all this time. The servant girl, a little calmer, bowed to her mistress and thanked her again, and Feed waved her goodbye. In fact, there's a saying in life that the more painful you are, the older you get and the more experience you gain in life. But even with all that, Feed didn't think it would be this painful. Yet she feels as if she's woken up from a long nightmare and finally has a chance to change her life in some way. And at a moment like this, she felt like she'd lost track of time even, but she knew it was for the best. After that incident, the father summoned his daughter to him or told her to meet him again, and after that meeting made a final determination. He'd gotten the idea that after their conversation it might be possible to solve this problem. So Feed agreed to this meeting, just for her father's sake. In fact, if one could just break that barrier after a few conversations with him, she clearly wouldn't be wallowing in the darkness she'd lived in her past life. For there would be absolutely no reason for her to run away from the one who had become her light in the darkness, who had become her salvation and hope for a better life. However, she could understand her father. After all her memories are stored only in her head, and there's nothing she can do about it. So she decided to say only what she was going to say, what she couldn't say in all the years they'd lived together. After a while, however, the man did come to their meeting, and when the feeder saw him, she even spilled a little tea on herself. The man carefully approached her and handed her a napkin, asked if she was okay, and inquired if she needed a handkerchief to wipe those stains. In fact, Nurse was very happy about this meeting, for she could finally see that her heart felt absolutely nothing in his presence. She realized that in all the years they had lived together, and after the loss of the child she had loved so much, all feelings had cooled for him, and only simple hatred remained. So in a cold voice, she replied that she was fine, and didn't need any help. Then she took a white-colored napkin out of her dress and began to wipe her stain, saying that she had something to wipe it herself. In fact, now Feed didn't love him at all, and she no longer had any reason to hate that unfortunate woman who had separated them then in the past. Then she turned to Bernard and said that she had something to tell him, but she was actually very happy because now she felt free in her actions and decisions. The man suddenly frowned and said that he certainly didn't like her saying that she loved him, but she kept doing it anyway. Then he also added that he was not the right person to make her happy, and he was sick of her obsessive behavior. Now she was finally convinced that her relationship with him had been terrible from the beginning. His eyes tore her heart to shreds, and his tongue grew sharper every day. And also that last time she'd said nasty things to his lover, and he'd even dared to raise a hand to her. Yes, that time she'd clung to his legs and even begged for forgiveness. But now it's going to be completely different. She even wants to find out something for herself, so that her soul can finally be at peace. So Cormilla turned to Bernard and said she knew perfectly well why he didn't want to marry her. The girl kept marveling at his ego. He probably thinks he's white and fluffy, but he's a tyrant when it doesn't concern his beloved Raina. He sat down opposite Cormilla and asked her what she wanted to say. For a while they just stared at each other in silence. But after that the girl spoke up and said that it was because of Raina that he didn't want to do it. Well, then she looked him straight in the eye and asked him why he hadn't told her at once that he didn't love her, and that he couldn't make her happy. He should have spoken directly and not kept anything from her. Then she wondered, with hatred in her voice, if he thought it was normal to treat other people that way. Why did he leave out so many details? It had caused huge misunderstandings. Bernard was incredibly angry. Then he asked how on earth she even knew about Raina's name. In fact, he was really quite surprised that Feed knew about all this. But the girl in turn said that she is absolutely sure that he did it only because he wanted to protect his beloved. However, this is not a good reason for such a terrible act, and she wondered what was the fault of the woman who had agreed to marry him. But Bernard found something to cling to, and smiling, said that she had been the first to speak of marriage, and was now behaving in a completely improper manner. Nurse was not going to give in to his provocations any longer, so she said no. After all, she had asked her father to break off the engagement, and her mother too. Seeing his surprised face, the girl said that her preparation for marriage with him had completely stopped. She did not want a husband who would not love her. The girl said that the reason she wanted to marry him was that she thought he would be a kind and good husband, as well as the father of their future children. Now, however, she was beginning to realize that he could never be that kind of man, at least not around her. Bernard was silent for a while, trying to understand the gravity of the situation. Then, smiling, he said that she was only saying that because she longed for someone who didn't belong to her. The girl was a little surprised at his self-confidence, but afterward laughed and said not at all. He could not be a good father and husband even to his beloved Raina. But the man continued to insist on his own and asked if it was her way of showing her jealousy. He thought it was funny, but the girl replied that he was wrong again even here, because he was just an ordinary coward. The Feed also added that he has no courage to go against his parents and brothers with his lover, and all he can do is to hide his lover and date her secretly. In fact, in her past life, the girl hated this Raina with all her soul, and if given the chance would even kill her. Well, and her abnormal husband she also hated, because not from his wife, who met the expectations of parents, nor from his incredibly great love. He could not and was not even going to refuse. He wanted everything at once. That's why it made them both miserable. Nurse said that he could not be a suitable husband for this woman, for he simply did not have the courage to admit his feelings, especially in front of his parents. To summarize, she said that he would not be able to stand up to his parents and family, whom he was afraid to cast aside, all questions and difficulties, but simply to love his woman and do everything possible for her happiness and the common good. And he, of course, does not even feel any guilt for not being able to love his wife, whom he married because of his parents' approval. He is a common coward, of which there are many on this earth. And even his lover thinks the same. It's not just Cormilla who thinks he's a yellow man who makes them both miserable. Then, smiling, she wondered if he thought he wasn't. Bernard was incredibly angry, but he was still able to contain his emotions so that he wouldn't show his worst side. They were silent for a while and just drank tea. Then, after a while, she said that she realized that he had nothing more to say, so she would go now. After all, she had her own things to do. The man, seeing this reaction, was very surprised. However, he did not even answer or say goodbye to the girl. She just turned around and started to leave. Shortly afterward he had sword practice, competing against his opponent, who was Jack Racknet, heir to the title of Marquis of Rachnan. When the boy told him the whole situation, Jack asked in surprise if that was why he looked so helpless. And then he added that his fiancée wasn't even ordinary. Bernard hesitated for a while. He missed a beat because of it, and the boy ran closer to him, asking if she was the reason he was so inattentive. Then he tried to knock the sword out of his hands, saying that even his grip on it was weak, let alone the girl's. but Bernard quickly got back into the game and immediately blocked his punch. He was able to fend the guy off, and thought to himself that he was once again using strange tricks that could not even be described in words. And so, while the man was thinking of a plan of action to push him away, Jack seized the opportunity and very quickly was able to defeat his opponent by knocking him to the floor. And just as he was about to plunge his sword into his chest, a man came out and told him to stop. Jack had already won, and it was settled. The guy put his sword away and smugly asked if he had heard His Majesty Max say that victory was his. Max Seaver, the crown prince of the empire, came over to them and said that it was immediately obvious that Bernard was distracted by his thoughts, which was the reason why he had let his guard down. Bernard turned to Jack and said he was surprised, for the lad had again managed to learn strange tricks in the time they had not seen each other. He smiled and with his hands in the air said that the most important thing was winning, and he had lost that after all. So it was not for him to judge. Jack leaned closer to him and told him that while he was wasting his time, he wasn't sitting idly by, he was practicing. Bernard stared at him for a while, but afterward he smiled and said that he seemed to have been too distracted lately, and this time it was indeed his own fault for his defeat. Here the friend spoke, and Max, smiling, said that he too had lately been unable to see his attendant's face, and it was very strange. He also said he was frustrated because it looked like he came out second best after the engagement. Bernard sighed heavily. He felt very ashamed of his behavior, then wondered if he had really been so aloof all this time. Jack lay down beside him and said that he had been away from them lately, but now he was very curious about this woman who was able to stir up his rough iron tower. For a while they lay there and just stayed silent. Bernard didn't want to answer that question. When Max turned around, he said that it was better to focus on becoming a top-ranked knight instead of thinking about such things. He sat down beside them and said that it was actually not good for his reputation when his attendant had the status of an ordinary knight. Bernard sighed heavily and said it was true, but then friend Jack turned to His Highness and asked why he did not give him such support, but only to this man. He wondered angrily if it was so right to support only him, but Maxime wondered what the point of supporting Jack was. He said the guy does his job properly after all and doesn't lose his mind in sparring when the most important moment is coming. The guy laughed at this moment and said that it was rightly so. He was pleased that His Highness had such an opinion of him. They were silent for a while, and after that, all three of them started laughing loudly. They had a very good and friendly relationship between them, so they took it lightly and easily. And when Jack was alone together with Max, His Majesty said that he thought Bernard was an absolutely iron man, but suddenly he showed weakness in the ring. He sighed heavily and said that he was sure Sir Bernard would deal with the problem sooner rather than later. Jack laughed and said he agreed, because Bernard's love had dulled his sword skills and his family's marriage had ruined him. That was a valid concern, so he understood him perfectly. His Majesty replied that he wasn't really worried, for Bernard was really done just being amused to see him waving his arms around in a duel. Jack agreed and said it was really interesting to watch because it was the first time he had ever seen his hands shake so much, and he straight up couldn't wait to see this Raina of his that was making the man so anxious and nervous. However, Max said that he shouldn't overdo it so much, because he might get his nose broken that way. Then you smilingly agreed and said that he was the kind of person who knew the line well. Jack also said he just wanted to check something out. Besides, it's only natural to want to look at this woman who has caused their friend to change so much. However, His Highness looked up and said that he rather liked the way Miss Feed had behaved in the situation, and he wondered if she had done wrong. After all, Bernard's method is to suppress those weaker than him for the sake of his own comfort. Jack said thoughtfully that apparently that was indeed true, but the man looked at him and replied that Bernard was very different from him. Max said that if he lost his way even once, it would be over for him forever. He wouldn't be able to get back on the start line. The guy waved his hand and said that perhaps that was indeed the case. After that, he asked His Highness if he really thought that this person would notice that someone was trying to fool him, because he felt that he was too stupid to do so. Max thought at this point that with a character like that, he should have heard at least something about it by now. However, he knew nothing at all even about that name, and he said, agreeing with Jack, that it was really just unbelievable. The two of them were so curious about what the girl had said to this steamy Bernard that he was so shocked that he couldn't even attend practice properly. In fact, Maxim knows perfectly well that the treasurer has a daughter, and that she was on the list of applicants to become the crown princess. But other than that, he knows nothing else. The man got up from the ground and said that he would like to see her at least sometime, for she was a very interesting person in his opinion. At this time, there was a suspicious silence in the mansion after the preparations for Cormilla's wedding had finally stopped. Now no one was particularly busy, and because of the mistress, that is, Cormilla, everything was turned upside down, and people no longer knew how to live still, because everything had changed. The girl herself was perfectly fine, but she's sure the others are thinking about not hurting her feelings and looking concerned about it when they're around. However, the girl thought it was something suspicious, because all the servants behaved docilely under her. But one day, as she sat in her study embroidering, she heard a very interesting conversation. One of the maids said that Reese ruined Madame's wedding and then walks around as if nothing happened. Reese had always stayed away from girls for they hurt her, and lately the girl had begun to cry very often. The other maids thought Mistress was an angel for allowing such behavior. And when Nurse overheard this, she was very surprised at the behavior of the maids. She never thought anyone would insult Reese. Well, of course, she can in no way turn a blind eye to this bullying, so she decided to take special measures to solve this problem. Soon Mistress gathered all the maids, who were excited and didn't understand why she had called them all. Many of them assumed it had something to do with the affair, so they couldn't wait for Mistress to come and explain everything to them. In a short time the feeder came out and her maid Reese was walking beside her. The girl was holding a basket with something poured in it. For a while everyone just remained silent. Some of the maids immediately began to bow to the mistress, but she clapped her hands to attract their attention and said that she thought there was no need to tell them why she had called them. The maid didn't say anything, they just bowed. And then they said in a guilty voice that it was all their fault. She smiled and said that they were absolutely right, but she also added that she had not come to scold them. When the maids heard this, they were very surprised. The girl herself at this point explained that she felt very sorry for Reese. However, she was even a little touched by their behavior, and in fact, she had been a rather strict and picky hostess all along. The girl at this moment started to descend the stairs to get closer to them, and she also said that now she wishes that because her marriage didn't work out, they weren't more upset and depressed than she was. I mean, they're even fighting over it. The maidservants, when they heard this, were overjoyed at such words of their mistress, and bowed to her again as a sign of respect. The girl was well aware that you can't rule with a whip, especially when it comes to regulating conflict, and the best solution is to mend everything. At that moment, the feeder turned to Reese and asked that she bring his maid, who was carrying a basket, and hand it to her, the mistress, at once. In fact, the best solution in preventing conflict is to have a good relationship with the maids and show that she understands and supports them perfectly. Mistress moved closer to them and said that she knew they were trustworthy, but she had no idea really that they were so loyal and kind to her. But now that she's found out about it, she wants to give them one reward. Not for their behavior with Reese, though. She walked over to one of the maids and quickly tied a lovely bow with a very pretty piece of jewelry in the middle on her hair. The maid looked at her in surprise and couldn't believe her happiness, and the feeder in her turn said that she was giving it to them as a token of their devotion and affection for her. The maids immediately began to look at those beautiful hair ribbons that Mistress had given them, and immediately began to thank her. After all, they were incredibly beautiful and expensive. Feed smiled, for she was pleased with herself and her imagination that she could come up with such a thing. Well, then she suddenly became more serious, and said that this certainly didn't excuse their actions towards Reese in any way, and they should be more careful in their words and actions from now on. The maids were positively beaming with joy, and they told the mistress that of course such a thing would never happen again, and they were incredibly grateful to her. After that, she approached Reese and put her arm around her, and told her that it was because of her that she was able to learn about the maid's attitude towards the mistress. So she asked them to be kinder to the girl, because she deserved it. Reese was very surprised at this behavior of her mistress, and she felt a little uncomfortable, for it was these maids who had been bullying and hurting her all along. However, at that moment, one of them moved closer to the girl and extended her hand as a sign of reconciliation. When Nurse saw this, she smiled and told the others that they could now return to their duties. The maids immediately put all the gifts from their mistress on their hair and were incredibly beautiful and satisfied. In fact, when Feed ran Bernard's mansion for several years in a row, there was a lot of trouble there. There were strange servants and helpers present in that house, and the master of the mansion was forever absent from home. However, she didn't have to worry about that at all now. The girl thought about the fact that she would never have been able to pay attention to all the aspects of managing the household, cooking and cleaning the house. But the moment Feeding was about to go inside her room, she suddenly stopped, thinking about the fact that she was learning how to be a beloved wife, after all. But she was never taught in that training how she should have acted in the situation she had with Bernard. Then the girl suggested that she might be the problem, and she might not be worthy of love. And even in this life, Cormilla wasn't sure it wouldn't happen again if she got married, even to someone else. Her feelings were so strong that she even began to cry. Tears flowed slowly and silently down her face, but suddenly she heard a noise behind her. When she turned around, she saw the maid kneeling on her knees. Reese, who continued to bow to her mistress, turned to her mistress, but she interrupted her immediately, asking what had gotten into her, and asked her to get up, as she didn't have to. The maid was incredibly happy about the deed the girl had done, and so, with tears in her eyes, she thanked her mistress for such incredible help. Feed was a little surprised. She didn't think she would be thanked, but then she realized that she hadn't even thought she could make so many people happy. She could be the person who would bring even small acts of kindness to bring happiness to people on the dreariest of days. In fact, Feed never even realized what her own happiness was. And now the girl thought that was why she had gone back in time. She was sorry that she had been so stupid and blind at that moment. However, since she now has a great opportunity to help various people, which is why Cormilla believes that God has given her such an incredibly wonderful chance for a better life. At this point, she walked over to the maid and stroked her head and smiled, saying that she knew perfectly well that she was good and not guilty of anything. And if there are any flaws in Reese, they are first and foremost the flaws of mistress, for she is her mistress. So Feeding asked that she not feel pressured by her mistress, because it was just a small act of kindness on her part. The maid started to wipe her tears and didn't even look mistress in the face. But then suddenly the feeder couldn't stand it and started hugging her tightly, saying that she just wanted the girl to be happy. After this, the lady returned to her room and sat until sunset at her embroidery, which she had begun quite recently. But suddenly she heard someone talking from her window, and when she looked out, she saw two maids standing there. Reese and another maid were standing there, and as the girl looked at them, she thought about how she really wanted the girl to be happy. And this situation reminds her of when you look at a child who is just starting to learn about life, and it's a really nice feeling. It's been a pleasure to watch it all. She was very glad that her difficult situation had been solved, and she hoped that everything would go her way, and she can finally find peace in her other way of life and no longer make the mistakes she used to. Cormilla looked at her embroidery, which was finally finished, and thought that maybe she would really succeed. All she had to do was put the past behind her and move on. But suddenly something terrible happened, and when Bernard heard about it from Max, he was furious. He was ready to rush and even to run to Raina on foot. But the Crown Prince tried to calm him down, telling him that he needed to exhale and be patient first. The man also told him that he would lend him the royal carriage. After all, that way he could get there as soon as possible. Bernard was indignant and said that he could not do that, for it was his carriage, and he could not borrow it just like that. Max, in that case, said that since he didn't want to take her, he would go with him, and when the guy heard that, he asked in surprise if he really wanted to do that. For some time he hesitated to speak, but Jack came up to him and put his hand on his shoulder, saying that his actions might be hasty, but he must not ignore His Majesty's feelings. And then, smiling, he asked if it wouldn't be safer for everyone if Bernard introduced them all to his lover, Raina. The man was very surprised when he heard this, but there was nothing else for him to do. He bowed before His Highness and said that he agreed to the proposal. Of course, there was nothing remarkable about it. However, for some reason it piqued Jack's interest, and he went along with them. He thought it very funny that Bernard, who was usually so prim and proper, was suddenly even suspended in judgment. And what got Jack's attention was that he was so out of it that it weakened his sword wielding, and he was even able to win a duel from him, although that had never happened before. In fact, to convey to Bernard's family that Raina's whereabouts and the boy's constant absence were connected was not something very difficult for him. On the contrary, it gave him the greatest pleasure, and all because this brother is beneficial not only for Bernard personally, but also for the faction of the Crown Prince's supporters. So if something goes wrong, it will hurt absolutely everyone, not just the guy himself. Jack also had a malicious intent, which I fed with curiosity. He wanted to see how Bernard himself would react to such a situation. In fact, the guy had assumed all along that this emotionless man wouldn't even react to such a thing. But it was not so, and he was wrong. Bernard's reaction to this act was incredibly strong and exciting. The man could not even sit still while he was riding in the carriage. He was shaking. Soon they came to the village where Raina lived, and drove up to a fine, small, and cozy house, which was not far away. In fact, thanks to Bernard's emotions, Jack had managed to find the fairy house after all. As soon as he entered, he saw his assistant, who was supporting the girl. Raina saw Bernard and smiled and wanted to approach him. She ran up to her lover and began to hug him tightly. The assistant bowed and apologized to the lord, saying that he had been inattentive and had failed to protect Raina properly. The girl looked Bernardo straight in the face and smiled brightly and said she was fine. She had only sprained her leg when she tried to run away from home. They hugged for a while longer, and Bernard was finally relieved to see his beloved safe and sound. At that moment, however, His Majesty and Jack entered the house. Jacka looked around and sighed heavily, saying that there were a lot of broken things in this house. Bernard's aide, when he saw Maximus, was very surprised, but immediately bowed, for it was the Crown Prince himself, and one had to show his respect. But then suddenly he turned to Mr. Bernard and said that a large group of people had come to the house for some reason. But still something was strange. He said the bandits were more interested in Mrs. Rain and had little interest in the property that was in the house. The aide bowed even lower and said that was why, for the sake of the Lord, he'd decided he'd rather protect the lady. And he realized that he was at fault, because he should have found out who was behind all this instead of being with Raina all the time. So he says he's willing to suffer his severe punishment for it. Bernard just remained silent for a while. Then, putting a hand on his shoulder, said that no, he had made the right decision, the one worth making. The man smiled and said that he didn't even know what might have happened if he hadn't hidden her in the secret passage, and he was even scared just thinking about it. He looked into the aide's face and said with all his heart and joy that he had protected her for his master after all, and also thanked him from the bottom of his heart for such a favor. Jack, who had gone out of doors and was watching all this from afar, thought of the fact that it was Bernard who had trained him from the beginning, and he would not have succeeded if he had chosen to come to this place and make his plan himself. But he was also interested in the phrase, secret passage. He didn't know since when Bernard could turn into a rabbit that digs 2 holes at a time, and he couldn't believe that he was the kind of person with increased intelligence. When it comes to protecting people, it even surprised him. But then he turned his gaze to Raina, who was watching her lover happily and couldn't get enough of him. And he realized that he didn't, because she was so important to him that he was going crazy, not knowing where the right decisions were and where the madness was. And Jack. It annoyed him a great deal. He thought it would be better if she disappeared once and for all, if he didn't have to go through this again and again, if it was easier for both of them. Then the guy turned to Bernard and said that they had already realized that she was very dear to him. But then he asked if he was really going to keep cuddling with her without even introducing the two of them. The guy got a little embarrassed even, and Jack kept talking and said that, apparently when he saw his beautiful lover, his friends went straight to the back of his mind. Bernard even blushed because he was too embarrassed and said that it wasn't like that at all. But then suddenly the girl decided to take the initiative. She went up to the boys and, saying hello, asked if she had understood correctly that they were Bernard's friends. When the men nodded, she said that it might sound strange under the circumstances, but she was actually glad that the opportunity had come up for her to meet them. everyone was silent for a while. But most of all, the boys were afraid of Max's reaction. However, he immediately smiled and told Miss Raina that he was also very happy to see her. The girl immediately went to the side, saying that since they had guests, then she should make tea. So she asked the men to wait a little while, for she would try to do it as soon as possible. However, Jack said that she didn't have to do it at all, but Raina turned around and smiled and said that of course she had to, and also asked that they wait a bit, because she could do it quite quickly. Soon all three were seated at a table that had to be turned, and chairs that were scattered all over the house. The men just sat in silence for a while. But soon Max spoke up and told Bernard that he had picked a very interesting woman, and she was really amazing, just as he had told them all along. But then suddenly the man became more serious and said that nevertheless, if they didn't do anything about it, it might turn out that they wouldn't be able to see her anymore. And then, in a cold voice, he also added that this could not be allowed to happen. Bernard agreed and said that she was indeed special. Jack, who wasn't thrilled about the whole thing, said that she didn't have to make tea for them. After all, she had hurt her ankle, and she'd better rest. But she is apparently very stubborn. Bernard laughed nervously and agreed and said that maybe it was really true, since it was the first time he had brought his friends. She was being stubborn because she wanted to be nice to them, and thanked them for not judging her for such foolishness. Max nodded his head and said he fully accepts this rudeness, for she knows nothing. However, it would be much better if they didn't tell who he really was, because useless information could only hurt. Bernard thought for a while, but then agreed. They sat in silence for a while, but then suddenly Max spoke up and said that if they didn't do something about it, they might not be able to see her again. Then the crown prince looked around and said that he had built a very beautiful mansion, but unfortunately it had been completely destroyed, and it was very sad. But Jack also entered into their conversation, and smiling, said that besides, his beloved could not stay in this place, so inquired what he would do in that case. Bernard was silent for a while, but then his friend asked him if he wanted to borrow a villa for her, because he liked this girl very much too. Max was a little surprised when he heard this, but then decided to move on to more serious matters and asked the man if he had any idea who could have done all this. He also added that if someone did find out about the place, then there is a high possibility that it could be someone in his inner circle. Bernard pondered for a while afterward, and said that it was probably one of those who hated him with all their souls, and so decided to take revenge in this way. However, then suddenly the crown prince said in a thoughtful voice that not necessarily the one who hated him could be the culprit in this situation. He also said it could have been his parents or a close friend, someone who might have done it because of concern for him. Jack, waving his hand, said that if there really was such a person, there was no way Bernard would trust him, so he didn't think anyone would interfere with something like that. After a short silence, Bernard turned to His Highness and said that after listening to him, something had occurred to him, and inquired if he could be excused for a little while. Maxim agreed. Then the guy immediately ran out of the table and started to run away. When he was already far enough away that he couldn't hear them, the man turned to Jack and said that he had made a mess of things after all. Jack didn't really know about other things, but he knew for certain that His Highness hated such incompetence. And His Highness can have someone replace him with more promising people who will fulfill their duties properly. So Jack just doesn't understand why Maxim allows such foolishness. Then suddenly Raina finally came out to them and said in a cheerful voice that they must have been waiting, and apologized, holding a tray of cups, saying that the kitchen was just an incredible mess, so she was a little late. They were all silent for a while, but then Maxim got up from the table and said that he was probably causing unnecessary trouble by his presence. Since the master had left, he should go too. The girl, hearing this, said nothing, and Jack approached His Highness, asking if he should go along with him. Maxim looked at him angrily, however, asking what the hell he was even talking about. After all, first he must take Bernard's lover to safety, and he himself would go after the boy. But he also told Jack in a quiet voice that the guy is on probation, and he himself knows perfectly well what he was guilty of. And Maxim himself at this moment thought about the fact that the guy should definitely take her to a safe place. because he would not forgive him if he did not obey him, and he really did not want him to create unnecessary problems and troubles for him. At this very time, Feed was sitting in her bedroom and began to do some new embroidery, but she kept getting distracted by the various thoughts that kept popping into her head. All the time, the girl was distracted by the fact that she was completely immersed in her past, which no longer existed, and it annoyed her very much. She couldn't concentrate on what she was doing now. She realized that she needed to forget about all this, and then life would be easier. But then she heard someone knocking on her door. She immediately answered that they could come out, because she wondered who it was. At this moment the door opened, and Reese entered the room and turned to her mistress cheerfully, saying that Mr. Bernard had come to see her. As she was feeding the feeder, she heard this, looked in surprise at the maid, and there in turn, said that he was going to discuss something very serious with the mistress. And here you can. It's even a good one. The girl still couldn't believe that Bernard had actually picked up and come to her. The maid came closer to her to see if she was all right. Nourished only got up from her seat and walked over to the mirror, asking that she tell him to come to the living room, just without any noise, and she would go there too. Reese smiled. She was actually glad that the mistress would meet him after all, and said that she would be sure to tell him so. After that, she went to Bernard's house. She didn't understand what this unannounced visit was, and she was annoyed that he dared to come to her house as if he hadn't even done anything wrong. She thought of the fact that it would be very improbable if she broke off the engagement by showing her excessive hatred, and after all, people must not guess her anger toward this man. So she decided that she should never show her displeasure around him, and when she looked in the mirror, she realized that she looked pretty good. So after that, she went to meet him, thinking that no one would know what was going on in her head. At this point, the other maids came over to help her get ready and wondered if she should add more jewelry, and another inquired what kind of tea she would like to drink at this meeting. They kept showering her with compliments about Carmilla's looks and various other qualities. In fact, initially the girl thought that the reconciliation of the maids, it was a very good idea. However, as it turned out, it had its side effects, namely that the maids loved her very much and were always around, trying to please her somehow. And since her mother was watching, she couldn't afford to scold them for it. But in fact, she was actually pleased with some of the maids' behavior. After all, they had all been a support to her in her time of need. As Feeding went to meet Bernard, she consoled herself with the thought that he had surely come to end their story once and for all. So she decided to hope only for the best. And so, as soon as she entered the room, she immediately came across his body. She wanted to ask him what had brought him here. But then something happened that she didn't expect. As soon as Nurse entered the room, Bernard immediately swung hard and slapped her on the cheek. His whole face was filled with anger toward the woman. And then he asked in a cold voice, stretching out each word, "Is she really going to kill Raina too?" And also asked, "Is this really how noble women with a good title are raised nowadays?" Nurse was very surprised at this behavior of the man. However, she remembered that everything was happening exactly the same way as the day before, and then, if she let her guard down for a moment, she would be pulled back into the past. Bernard kept yelling at the girl, asking her all the while why she'd done it. He didn't understand why she would do something like that. After all, the girl had said before that she would back off, but he supposed she probably wanted to take them by surprise again, and that's why she'd done it. The man continued to shout at her, expecting some sort of response from the girl, but Feed couldn't gather her thoughts, for she was stunned after such a blow. Actually, the normal relationship for this couple was when the husband is mad at Carmilla because of Raina, and she only gets angrier and even more toxic because of it, so the scandal develops at a higher rate.